I'm a firm believer that we do not meet anyone by accident, that each encounter is for a purpose. Sometimes we learn from them. Sometimes they learn from us. Sometimes we experience their suffering and their loss. Sometimes we experience their joy. But for every single person that's brought into our life, there is a purpose. There are times when I'm profoundly and deeply grateful that God has sent somebody into my life. And there are other times like you, where I wish, for whatever purpose they were brought, they would also be sent. Here's the truth. Every person that comes into our life is there for a meaning and a purpose. Sometimes a long time, sometimes a short time. Sometimes we learn more about ourselves in the relationship than we do about them. In today's gospel, an incredible story. Two guys, dismayed, disgusted, walking away. They are so frustrated with what's happened that they have a plan to walk away and perhaps never return. They have bought a one-way ticket out of Jerusalem with no intention to return to a place that has no hesitation to brutally attack and murder the Messiah of the world. And so they walk in their frustration, frantic with fear. And there they are, trying to console each other, compare stories, contemplate the future. And along comes a third party and walks with them. Watch for the strangers, my friends. It is the strangers in our life that can bring good news. Jesus Christ appears to every single one of us on a regular basis, but he does so in disguise. More often than not, we will see him in many forms and miss it because we're so caught up in our own emotions, our own fears, our own anxieties, our own disappointments, that we don't see that glimmer of hope given to us by Christ in his presence with us. One of my favorite ministries in this place is my time on Thursday evenings at Cedarview, where we have a small group of seniors that come together, anywhere from 7 to 15 of them, and we sit together in the chapel that was built for 12, and we talk about life and faith and the journey. Last week we were talking about the strangers that come into our lives. Those moments when we know that we've been touched by God, but we don't tell anybody to make sure we don't get locked up. One of the women whispered to me after the session, "I'll never forget the night that I went to bed and I curled up on my side of the bed. And I was just about asleep. And then I felt it. That arm coming around me, squeezing me around the waist. My husband used to hold me like that." Now, whether you see that as a vision, or an imagination, or a statement of faith, I've got to tell you, over 23 years, I have heard hundreds and hundreds of stories just like that. Parents and grandparents that appear in dreams to provide guidance, consoling, love, and support. Jesus walked along these two discouraged men, and he poured himself into them. He talked about the history of not just the church, but of faith, from Moses all the way through the scriptures, interpreting the meaning. So many of us, in difficult, dark times of our life, abandon Scripture and walk away as it's unfulfilled in our lives. And yet, to return to Scripture, to really read and study what it has to say to us, are constant words of affirmation and encouragement and support in the most difficult moments of life. And Jesus poured himself into them. But still, they didn't recognize him. Have you ever been in the middle of a conversation with somebody in the room and you were so intense in your conversation that you didn't notice they left the room? They hardly knew he was there. And so they come to a crossroads, and Jesus is walking on, and they invite him into an inn to share a meal. They're so fascinated by this stranger that they want to talk more. Notice that Jesus does not push himself into the situation. If you're waiting for Jesus to burst into your situation and to fix it, whether it's a wounded marriage, a tough time at work, a difficult situation with one of your kids or grandchildren, no matter what it is, Jesus will not burst in and interfere in your life until you invite him into the situation. And these two men invited him in, brought him with them, and they sat and they began to enjoy a meal, and when he broke bread, they suddenly recognized him. There are moments for us, in any stage of our faith, where although we wouldn't tell a soul, Jesus has been dead for us for a long time. The church is dying fast. We're sure of it. There's more fights about building than there is building of relationships. We're not quite sure if the faith will survive. And then Jesus shows up and stands on the outskirts and waits for us to invite him in to remind us yet again, this is not our church. This is not our faith. This is about Jesus Christ once and for all. And he can be our greatest strength, our greatest sense of hope, but only if we invite him in. And he disappears. And they get up and they walk all the way back to Jerusalem. They've spent 7 hours walking away. And now they have a pivotal moment and they turn around and they go back. Here's the message. If you don't like where you are, move. You're not a tree. If you don't like where you are emotionally, psychologically, or spiritually, or even physically, get up and do something about it. I had an occasion to spend 5 hours in an airport. My plane was delayed, and so was that of the person I was with. Her name was Diane. I had been mentoring her for a year, and it was time to say goodbye. The group had dissembled and going their own way. And she sat with me and she said, do you remember when we met, Steve? When we met, my husband had ended our marriage. My congregation had fired me. I was sick and frightened and alone. And in this time, to be able to unpack my pain, regain my strength, learn how to stand on my own by faith again, now I get on this plane to go to a new congregation and a new beginning where I'm going to live in the city where my kids live for the first time in 20 years. We are not in the dark forever. We are not on a long road by ourselves for long. Christ constantly comes along. The question is, will you recognize him? Invite him into the conversation. More often than not, what happens is that we're too frightened of what we might say to him. Let me assure you of this. He has the shoulders strong enough to bear any language you can throw out. Some of us, like the two men on the street, need to be prepared to use what is commonly referred to in the seminary as language 1. Let me give you a few examples. George Carlin's favorite 5 words. Do you remember George Carlin? Yes, you do. You're just pretending because you're in church. We get frightened about talking to God because we think it needs to sound like the Book of Common Prayer. Oh, great thou. When what you're really thinking is, God can handle it. God can handle it. He's waiting for you to be honest with him. These men were honest with Jesus. They talked about their frustrations, their irritations, their loneliness, their confusion. And he brought them to a crossroads of peace. This morning's gospel is about the reminder that in the darkest, most lonely moments of life, Jesus shows up. Did you notice that he was there to point the way and to walk with them in the next stage of their journey? And so this morning I simply want to leave it this way. You meet no one in your life by accident. Everyone is there for a purpose. Take full advantage of the gift when they show up. It might be Christ in disguise.